Posted by you/Little Chub. What the scariest true story you know? I've told this story before. I'm an eye doctor and I had a patient come to me with an infected eyelid 2 other eye doctors tried to treat and failed. They were dumping all sorts of medicine into it and it wasn't getting any better. At this point, it was swollen and painful for weeks with no improvement despite being on tons of meds. Apparently, neither of them thought to flip the lid upside down, you know that gross trick some kids do with their upper eyelids? It was a painful maneuver for her very swollen eyelid, which might explain it. Anyhow, there appeared to be what looked like a visible abscess inside the tissue with thick gooey material. I thought I'd give it a nudge and saw it move. This wasn't an abscess, it was something else. I managed to remove it quite easily in one whole piece. It was a fly larva. The patient told me that she had a bug hit her in the eye a few days before she got this infection. I removed the larva and within 2 days the wound closed and she was 100% recovered on basic antibiotic eye drops. Yes, I do have the photos from this case for those interested. TLDR, patient had a bug lay an egg in her eyelid and I removed the larva. I could not speak. I became unconscious. I could not open my mouth because then I smelled something terrible. I heard my daughter snoring in a terrible way, very abnormal. When crossing to my daughter's bed, I collapsed and fell. I was there till 9 o'clock in the morning, of Friday, the next day, until a friend of mine came and knocked at my door. I was surprised to see that my trousers were red, had some stains like honey. I saw some starchy mess on my body. My arms had some wounds. I didn't really know how I got these wounds. I opened the door. I wanted to speak. My breath would not come out. My daughter was already dead. I went into my daughter's bed, thinking that she was still sleeping. I slept till it was 4:30 in the afternoon, on Friday, the same day. Then, I managed to go over to my neighbors' houses. They were all dead. I decided to leave, because most of my family was in WUM. I got my motorcycle. A friend whose father had died left with me, for WUM. As I rode through Nyos, I didn't see any sign of any living thing. When I got to WUM, I was unable to walk, even to talk. My body was completely weak. The Franklin Expedition. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 British sailors and military personnel on 2 ships embarked on a mission to find the Northwest Passage from the Atlantic across to the Pacific through Arctic waters. The ships, named HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, 2 former warships reclassified as icebreakers thanks to their sturdier builds, departed British waters in the 1845 and were never seen again. In subsequent rescue attempts and investigations, it was discovered that quite possibly everything that could have gone wrong on the expedition did so. The weight of the ships with their reinforced hulls and decks designed to fire mortars and cannons off of worked against them, as much of the waters crossed were shallow and filled with rocks and icebergs. The time chosen to launch the expedition occurred at one of the coldest Arctic periods in recent history, meaning the polar ice and, particularly the pack ice, didn't melt like usual as the ships became locked in the frozen water and essentially experienced an endless winter for over 4 years. The food they stored, which was supposed to last for years thanks to the revolutionary new process of canning, was bought at the lowest bidder. Much of the food was improperly sealed and spoiled, leading to food poisoning, and even the ones that were properly sealed and kept intact were riddled with lead thanks to the soldering used to keep the food inside fresh. In conjunction with the lead pipes in the ships the men would have been drinking out of for years meant the entire crews of both ships was slowly being infected with all manner of diseases, namely botulism, scurvy and heavy lead poisoning, which also affects the mind, leading to memory loss, heavy paranoia and general mental deterioration, combined with already present tuberculosis that killed a small number of the crew before departing to the Arctic. After about 2 to 3 years stuck in the ice, the captain in charge of the voyage, John Franklin, and many other crew members died in unknown circumstances, and the remainder decided to abandon ships and try and hike out together to the nearest trading outpost and back Fish River in Canada, hundreds of miles away, by loading up their rowboats with supplies and fixing them on sleds to be pulled. All remaining crew perished on that journey. Their remains discovered by local Inuit/Netsilik tribes, who described desolate campsites of skeleton-like corpses with hazily built, half-open tents and even human body parts in cook pots, heavily implying that the men resorted to cannibalism in their last desperate hours. Happened to my boss's best friend when they were around 17. Best friend's parents were out of town one weekend and she has the house to herself. Went about her business having dinner, watching TV, then decided to go to bed. She was lying in her bed with her back to her closet when she heard the door open. She somehow pretended to be asleep. The man who was hiding in the closet walked around her bed to the side she was laying/facing, gently stroked her hair and face, then left. She immediately called her boyfriend to ask him to come over, then called her parents and then the police. Long story short, this man had been getting into their home via a doggy door. They didn't have a dog and didn't bother to secure it, and he'd been living in a tent in the foresty area behind their home for months to creep on her. They found a ton of surveillance footage of her sleeping and pieces of her clothes and stuff. If I recall correctly, this happened somewhere in Alabama, most likely mid-2000s. A young lady had an affair with her boss in the 1960s, got pregnant. After threatening to tell her boss's wife, she was killed by her boss, who then put her body in an industrial barrel. He hid the barrel in his house for years and none of the various owners opened it due to the weight. Finally, one guy decided to dispose of it in the 90s, and when he opened it, he saw it contained something. An investigation traced the barrel and girl back to the man, who then killed himself before police could come arrest him after confirming he was the father of the unborn baby via DNA. The lady's mother was in her late 80s when she was told her missing daughter was finally found. She claims that she had been having dreams about her daughter being inside a metal container for years after she had gone missing. This isn't a scary story, but it's spooky and always captured my imagination. One day a bunch of, I think they were police in training, explored some of the catacombs under Paris. A lot of them are completely unmapped. They entered an area and heard dogs barking and snarling. They continued going and saw there were speakers mounted on the wall, playing pre-recorded dog sounds and cameras. They continued. They came into this huge opening and found a cinema. It was lavishly decorated. It had projectors and a mix of old and new movies. It even had electricity running and 3 phone lines. The police marked where they were and went back outside. The next day they returned to try and investigate further with more experienced officers. Everything was gone. All the wiring had been ripped out, all the furniture was gone. All that remained was a note that said, "Do not try to find us." As far as I know, they never figured out who was there. The story of Jamie Kloss is terrifying. In rural Wisconsin last year, a 13-14-ish-year-old girl went missing after her parents were murdered in their home. Police arrived within 4 minutes or so, but she is just gone. Of course, speculation is that she was kidnapped, or that she was in on it, or dead, or whatever. Nobody knows because she has completely vanished. 88 days later, in the dead of a northern Wisconsin winter, she runs out into the street to a woman walking her dog. She had been held captive about 40 minutes from her home. All of that is scary enough, but here's the terrifying part. She had never had any contact with the guy that murdered her family and abducted her. One day he was driving to a new job, at which he only lasted a day, and saw her get on the school bus. At that moment he decided that he was going to take her. There was no warning. No grooming. There was absolutely nothing that she or her family could have done to avoid everything. A creepy young man saw her from 100 away and decided that he would murder her family and take her for himself. The war crimes that Unit 731, Japanese, have done, including but not limited to dissecting Chinese and Koreans' children alive, or vivisection, raping babies, syphilis and frostbite testing on Chinese, steaming Chinese alive etc. The data that 78% of human body is made of water is partially a result of the 731 drying experiment, where Japanese scientists roasted Chinese civilians to death in a high-temperature room for 15 hours, then weighed the dried mummy body and compared it with the victim's body weight before the experiment. A story I heard from my grandpa is that they lured orphans with food because Chinese were starving during the long-lasting World War II, tricked them saying the injections were vaccines against flu while it's actually full of STI virus, then observed them slowly dying in agony, but continuously supplying them basic nutrition so they would last for as long as possible. The Nanjing Massacre is just a cornerstone of the terrible war crimes conducted by the Japanese imperial armies, where half of the population from one of the most developed cities in China at the time were just wiped out in 10 days, bodies were burnt for months. The world history has never witnessed such a cliff drop in population. The Imperial Japan did not consider Chinese Koreans or Indonesians as humans, they're referring to them as monkeys and logs, even the Auschwitz camp is acknowledged. But Unit 731 and the terrible biological warfares have never been acknowledged by Japanese up till today, not to mention apologies, even though there are evidences and memorials everywhere all over Asia. My grandpa always says history is written by the winners, but these horrible things really happened. He remembers his parents being killed in front of his eyes by the Japanese. People remember. I've told this story before. I'm an eye doctor and I had a patient come to me with an infected eyelid. 2 other eye doctors tried to treat and failed. They were dumping all sorts of medicine into it and it wasn't getting any better. At this point, it was swollen and painful for weeks with no improvement despite being on tons of meds. Apparently, neither of them thought to flip the lid upside down, You know that gross trick some kids do with their upper eyelids? It was a painful maneuver for her very swollen eyelid, which might explain it. Anyhow, there appeared to be what looked like a visible abscess inside the tissue with thick gooey material. I thought I'd give it a nudge and saw it move. This wasn't an abscess, it was something else. I managed to remove it quite easily in one whole piece. It was a fly larva. The patient told me that she had a bug hit her in the eye a few days before she got this infection. I removed the larva and within 2 days the wound closed and she was 100% recovered on basic antibiotic eye drops. Yes, I do have the photos from this case for those interested. A guy I was good friends with had a party one night and called me to invite me over. It was me and my wife's first day off together in a while and our daughter was 2 years old. I mentioned it to my wife and my daughter said no, don't go daddy. Of course I can't resist that, so I stayed home and we had a good night. My friend, however, had the worst night of his life. His party was going good and everything was fine, even though there was a friend of a friend there who no one really knew. Turns out the stranger had been smoking PCP and decided to start killing people. He took a butcher knife and slashed 3 people's throats. My friend's wife threw their kids out of a 2-story window and jumped out herself, took them into the woods and called the police. All 3 people died. The police found the guy walking down the side of the road covered in blood and incoherent. He had no idea what he just did. So he said, "What really pisses me off is he was such a good guy. He was a big biker-looking teddy bear. Was never an asshole to anyone and always did what was the right thing. We worked together and hit it off from day one. Always ready with a joke and smile. Maybe not going saved my life, or maybe I could have helped, that weighs on me even 20 years later. The fact that some little poss destroyed the lives of 3 good families that he didn't even know really pisses me off, and I hope he rots in prison and gets his ass kicked every day. Rip Blaine. You were a good man." My mother works in hospice, which is basically where people are sent to die as comfortably as possible. Cancer patients and elderly galore there. Anyways, the scariest stories I know are when the dying patients basically lose rights to make decisions about their bodies. Sometimes it's because of Alzheimer's or dementia, but that means it's often your kids or your grandkids calling the shots for your health. Well, my mom didn't work in hospice for long because a lot of kids or grandkids will selfishly keep these people alive for as long as possible. And let me tell you, there's only so much morphine they can give you without killing you, and the body is capable of dishing out a lot of pain that pain meds can't fix. There is also a particularly cruel type of cancer that affects the pain regions of your brain. Really, there is a reason people advocate for compassionate death when one is suffering from terminal illness. Death is natural. Sometimes turning off the machines is the right thing. But when your next of kin feels sad about the idea of you dying, sometimes something that should have taken a few days will be dragged out for years to come. These patients aren't happy or enjoying their last few days. They are suffering. They beg for more painkillers when they've already reached maximum dosage. Sometimes they ask to die and you can't just let nature take its course. This is literally my worst nightmare. I promised my mother if she ever gets that sick I won't do that to her, and I'm sticking to my guns. Sometimes they will stop eating in an attempt to die, and then the nurses are forced to stick a tube down their throats to keep them alive. This is, in my opinion, torture. People, don't do this to your elders, please. Don't make them beg for death. The Fritzl Case. A man named Joseph Fritzl, who lived in a small town called Amstetten in Austria, fakes the disappearance of her daughter Elizabeth. In reality, he keeps her captive for 24 years in a hidden room in the basement of his house he had been working in as a nuclear shelter. During this period of time, he assaulted his daughter several times and had several children with her who grew older over time in this room. When one of Elizabeth's children died shortly after being born, he just took the body from her and incinerated it. He also regularly punished them by cutting the electricity or not bringing them food. Joseph wanted to take care of the children with his wife, Elizabeth's mother, who wasn't aware of the events in her basement, so he'd make Elizabeth write fake letters and then he would pretend he found the babies in their porch. In 2008, when one of Elizabeth's oldest daughter, Kirsten, fell sick, Joseph sent her to a hospital. After a long talk, Joseph let Elizabeth go see her daughter at the hospital. The police catched them in the hospital and interrogated them. Elizabeth told them her long and horrifying story, but no, before she could make them promise she would never have to see her father again. Not as bad as most of what's here, but an interesting deep-sea study was conducted last year that has some frightening implications. Marine biologists took 3 alligator carcasses and dropped them 6,600 feet into the Gulf of Mexico. This is deep enough that there is no natural light, therefore no plants. Without plants, the ecosystem must sustain itself on marine snow, which is usually scraps of dead animals that were partially eaten nearer to the surface, but the less desirable pieces weren't touched and sank. The ecosystem this deep is basically all scavengers, with a few small predators. The first of the 3 gators was fully consumed after less than 24 hours, by giant amphipods, large deep-sea invertebrates the size of a grapefruit. The second was consumed more slowly, after 51 days only bones were left. Interestingly, a new species of bone-eating worm was found on the remains. The third carcass is the one that gives me chills. When the scientists sent their probe down to look at it, it was gone. Not a trace. There were drag marks on the seabed and the ropes used to hold it in place had been torn apart, but other than that, it was gone. In waters this deep, most animals are the size of a cat or smaller. They stay small because food is so scarce. To be big enough to tear through rope, pick up an 80-pound gator, and leave with it, whatever took it must have been an order of magnitude larger than anything that lives that deep. It's possible it was a shark, but sharks of the estimated size required don't often live so deep. We still don't know what took that gator. The Cheshire Murders. Family of 4 is followed for days by 2 guys. They break in one night by knocking the dad out and tying up his wife and 2 girls. The next morning, they drag the wife to several banks to have her withdraw money. One bank realized something was up and asked if she needed help. She said no, that they would go away. Meanwhile, the police have already cornered the house and locked it down from a distance, but they're not moving because it's a hostage situation. The wife gets home and the 2 men begin to rape the girls while the husband is tied up in another room. The wife is then raped and murdered. While this is going on, the husband breaks free of his bonds and escapes to a neighbor's house. The 2 men realize that the dad escape and kill the 2 daughters. Meanwhile, the police still do nothing until the husband finally contacts them and they move in. The whole thing went down over 2 days with the police in full knowledge of it happening. Yet they did nothing. The husband remarried and has a kid. He's also running for town selectman of Cheshire, Connecticut to make sure this never happens again.